The 144Hz revolution was one of the most important events in the history of GD. It shaped the playing community as we know it today and had enormous and far-reaching consequences on the game as a whole. Today we'll be going over the event and answering some important questions about it. How did this event occur? What developments happened while it was underway? And finally, what consequences did it have as a result? This is how 144Hz changed Geometry Dash forever. In order to understand the 144Hz revolution, we first need to examine how prior events caused and contributed to it. The 1.9 update introduced a lot of new features to GD, such as the wave game mode and the ability to use most songs on Newgrounds in a level, as opposed to only having access to the music used in the official maps. But perhaps the most significant addition in the update was getting Geometry Dash on Steam. In previous versions of the app, the vast majority of the player base chose to play on a mobile device because playing on PC required the use of an emulator, such as BlueStacks. But once it was available on the Steam store, more and more players chose to play Geometry Dash on a personal computer. The biggest consequence of this was the creation of a competitive playing community. The community we know today, where dozens of active top players are constantly pushing the limit of how difficult of levels can be beaten by a human, didn't exist in 1.8 and earlier. Sure, there were popular figures such as Aeon Air and Alex Payne who beat hard levels and were widely considered to be the best players in the game, but it was nothing like what it is in 2022. Competition between these players in events like level races was rare. Compared to today, there was a shortage of number 1 demons to race on, as levels of this variety were actually looked down upon for their bad gameplay as opposed to now being fetishized in the game's younger player base. Generally speaking, a screenshot of your completion was good enough for most people, and if you had video evidence of the finishing attempt, that proved you were legit at the time. The community's lack of awareness for methods of cheating that would never go under the radar today meant that the database of top players and number 1 demons was plagued by hacked impossible levels. This changed with the introduction of Geometry Dash on PC, however. Spacebars, up arrows, and gaming mice made the game much easier than on a touchscreen, and as players got used to their new devices, they began to be capable of beating levels never thought possible before. With these new developments, modern technologies such as hack detection and the demon list began to appear out of necessity, and throughout the update, many illegitimate players such as Andromeda and Cyclic were forced to confess to hacking. A large influx of players, notable inclusions being Riot, Cyclic, Sandstorm, and Andromeda, began racing on some of the hardest levels as a result of all this. The attitude towards difficulty turned 180 degrees, and suddenly extreme demons were all the rage. Now with a burgeoning competitive community, tons of players wanted to show the world that they were the best player, and began searching for ways to gain an advantage over the competition. And the best way to do this, besides hacking at least, was with a higher refresh rate monitor. Riot was a player who had built his career on the completions of levels such as Deadly Clubstep, Cataclysm, and Ice Carbon Diablo X. When he wasn't verifying his upcoming new top 1 level Bloodbath, he was beating countless other insane and extreme demons in order to build his GD and YouTube profiles in close competition with Cyclic and to a lesser extent Andromeda, who were both later revealed to be hackers, and so he needed any advantage he could get. That advantage came in the form of his 144Hz gaming monitor. Top players in many other competitive games, mainly first-person shooters, use the same technology to get an advantage in their respective games. Put simply, being able to see more frames per second allows for better vision of what you're playing, making it a little bit easier. However, until the release of Bloodbath, the difference between playing on 60Hz and 144Hz was seemingly negligible. Sure, Riot's monitor gave him an FPS advantage of over 100%, but at the time, the hardest levels in the game would be considered entry-level extremes today. We didn't have levels as precise as Slaughterhouse, Tartarus, or Sakupin Circles where your refresh rate actually mattered. The insane to extreme demon difficulty ceiling of the time was a difficulty level where those monitors were just starting to have a slight effect on performance, or so players in 1.9 would have thought. The demons at the time, except for ICDX, managed to, for the most part, avoid the main advantage of 144 Hz because they got their difficulty without the use of one key game mode, the ship. As this video demonstrates, the ship on 60 Hz is far more sensitive to your input than on 144 Hz. On any difficulty from 2-star to Insane Demon, this doesn't make levels that much easier, but when you reach the level of Extreme Demon, the margin for error becomes far slimmer. When you only have a 1-block high corridor to maneuver your ship through, having one that doesn't move as erratically makes a world of difference. But aside from ICDX, no demon had a significant amount of straight fly for Riot to flex his monitor on. However, that all changed when he verified his passion project, Bloodbath. Bloodbath has a ton of straight fly, the level mostly consists of it, and so Riot proved his superiority with an achievement that was leaps and bounds above anything else at the time, with the hardest demon previously being Cataclysm. This raises the question, how much of Riot's dominance over other players was achieved through raw skill and how much of it was due to his hardware? Perhaps we can gain an insight by looking at what happened directly after the verification. The efforts of several players to become the first victor of Bloodbath are documented in a video titled The Race to Beat Bloodbath by Alfritz. The first two people to seriously try to slay the demon were Sandstorm and Smokes. These two were no joke, they were some of the best players of their time. Sandstorm, in addition to being the first to legitimately beat Cataclysm, was later able to beat Bloodbath in 3 days after obtaining Riot's hardware. And Smokes would later go on to build and verify Plasma Pulse Finale, a former #1 demon which was dethroned by Bloodlust. Both of these players were insanely skilled, and some in the community believe that Sandstorm had the potential to rise to legendary status in GD history, much like Riot, N-Switch, and Space UK, but neither of these people made it even halfway through the level, and Alfred lists their monitors as the main reason why.
But just like Smokes, Sandstorm was held back by his monitor's refresh rate.
Smokes even had a 120 Hz monitor, but still failed because he didn't gain the physics advantage of 144. But before we conclude that Riot only rose to the top because of his OP gaming equipment, let's take a look at the person who did slay this beast of a level, GD Quasar. Quasar and his competitor, Serve, unlike previous contenders, had 144 Hz monitors, and yet it still took him a month and over 28,000 attempts, whereas Riot, after a few months of on and off effort, did it in about 25,000. And so, in the case of Riot, if we consider Sandstorm as a special case and only talk about where he was in relation to other players, then his 144 Hz monitor likely was not the secret to his success. It certainly gave him a significant edge over his competition, but was not enough on its own to make him a legend. Without the monitor, Riot still would have likely been the best legitimate player, just not quite as good as he was. Bloodbath still would have been made as well, just significantly easier and with far less straight fly. One thing's for certain, however, Riot's reign as the best player popularized 144 Hz monitors in the GD community, and for better or worse, they would be an important part of every top player's arsenal from then on. By the end of the race to beat Bloodbath, both of the main contenders were using these monitors, and it was recognized in the community that having one was a major advantage over someone playing on 60 or even 120 frames per second. Top players would take note of this and attempt to acquire modern equipment before going for new hardest levels. The new technology enjoyed by many players, first 144 Hz, then 240, 280, and so on, enabled them to achieve things never thought possible before. Only about a year after Bloodbath fell, Sonic Wave, Cyclic's hacked project which sits over 100 spots above Bloodbath on today's demon list, was also legitimately beaten. A new era of competition was born, and people today continue to push the limits of human skill at breakneck speed. The results of the 144 Hz revolution weren't entirely positive. The rise of extreme demons has caused the trend to be exploited by compilation channels and also caused creators to avoid creativity, focusing instead on making as many #1 demons as possible. Additionally, the rapidly rising skill ceiling has made being a top player difficult, stressful, and frustrating, and it's been virtually impossible for returning or new players to rise up to meet the challenge. This could potentially cause a decline of the competitive playing community. I talk more about these issues in a recent rant video I made titled, "Why are there so many forgettable top 1s in GD?" Check it out if you're interested. Those who could not obtain the necessary hardware to keep up lagged behind in terms of hardest demon progression, even forming their own communities and demon lists that would be accurate to their hardware. For example, the mobile community did this due to an inability to keep up with the Steam community in an event documented by Septagon and Tried. Other than that documentary, players on phone haven't gotten enough attention for their completions due to not being able to compete with high refresh rate Steam players. The only way for those without the latest monitor to come even close to technological equality was with FPS bypass. It's not as good as having the setup and for a long time was banned on the demon list. This largely affected Nswish, the former best demon list grinder in GD before he got a good monitor. Currently, the hardest level beaten on mobile is Crimson Planet, sitting at a measly 20th place on the PC demon list, and the hardest one on a low refresh rate phone is Sonic Wave at number 71. This is also the hardest demon on a 60Hz PC to my knowledge. The 144Hz revolution created the playing community as we know it, and enabled the massive leaps in the game's skill ceiling. However, this has also caused many problems such as those who play on low refresh rates being left in the dust by their more fortunate counterparts. Now that you've learned how the 144Hz revolution affected top players, perhaps you'd be interested in checking out the history of top players in GD. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed today's documentary, and tell me what you think of it in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.